this is Mrs. G. Marie Russo Warren, and we're going to be talking about the origin of her side of the family and where it fits into the American story. Just like to start off, where did our family come from?
Well, all four of my grandparents arrived through Ellis Island from Sicily.
Do you know where exactly in Sicily?
I've never been there, but I can tell you the names of the places. Let's see. My father's parents both came from Enya, and my grandmother, which would be your great-grandmother, was from Rocamolta, Sicily, and your great-grandfather on my mother's side came from Castelvetrano.
Wow, those are some big words.
Yes, it's hard.
How do you know where they came from?
We have written record, and we have this handy-dandy book that my parents had put together for us, and we've seen various records and great resources that my parents have remembered to keep and share with us along the way.
How many generations can we trace back?
I believe it is 10 now, if we include yours. So we have 10 generations back to 1791.
Wow, that's really cool. Can you recall names?
Of those generations?
Yes.
Well, on my father's side, your grandfather and his father and so on, we have a lot of Severio Russos. And that is how we came up with your name, Savvy, because my dad in America's nickname was Savvy, and a long line of Severios and Salvatores, and I just thought it was a really cool name. And I've since lived up to your name of being Savvy.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. But then we have Annibal, which when he came over, actually his name was Annibal Cartagine, and when they were taking his name at Ellis Island, it sounded, or they created the name Anthony, and so that's what he became in his American version. I think that happened to a lot of people. And some Rose Cartagines. She was actually Rose Matina side, and Liboria del Pietro. So we had the De Pietros. Yeah.
So we know where my great-grandparents came from. Where did my grandparents come from? Like, where were they born?
They were born in Brooklyn, New York.
And then you guys?
A little bit of that story. So my grandparents, so my mother's mother and father, they grew up in a community within Brooklyn where a lot of Italians lived, and my dad's family lived in that area too. So in the time that they were being raised, it was very common that you would grow up with your culture, so people who were from where you were from. And so my grandparents lived in Brooklyn, and when they, as a part of their culture, they also had these little bungalows on Coney Island, I believe. So both sets of grandparents grew up in a house or bungalow next to each other, and they kind of grew up together. Their siblings were friends. They just did a lot of stuff together. And when my grandmother was 18 and my grandfather was 20, he asked my grandmother's brother if he would ask my grandmother for whether or not she would marry him. And my grandmother was a little feisty, your great-grandmother, not a surprise, and she said no, because she didn't think that she wanted to marry somebody who wasn't going to ask directly. So they went their ways. He actually asked his parents to sell the house that was next door, and they moved away. And but as, again, kind of culturally, part of what they did was they would get together as the Italian neighborhood friends and distant relatives, and they would have parties and stuff, and so they came across each other. And 7 years later, my grandfather was engaged to be married to another woman, also by the name of Rose. And when they were at a party, he ran into my grandmother, and when later that night after he was taking his fiancée home, and he told her that he couldn't marry her because he was in love with the other Rose. And so I guess he got up the nerve to ask her directly, and we became a part of history. So, and then my mother was the youngest of 3, and my father was the youngest of 7, and they lived down the street from each other in this Italian neighborhood. Lots of overlapping family members, so nothing scary. But my dad had he had a sister who married my mother's cousin, and we had a couple of situations like that where the 2 families. And then we had 2 brothers married to sisters. So, but nothing scary. Anyway, they grew up down the street and didn't see each other again for many years, and then when they finally did, my dad had been in college with my mother's brother, so they were fraternity brothers, and when he saw my mom after many years, he was like, oh my goodness, that's little Rosalie, and
All grown up.
And so they ended up getting married later. Yes.
Do we have any records of birthdays?
We have birthdays. We certainly have my parents' records of birthdays. Grandparents, not so sure about. I have dates and things like that, but I don't know that I actually have their physical records because it would be from Sicily, so we don't have those records on hand.
Do we have any veterans in the family?
My father, he was actually, so your grandfather was, he was in college during a lot of World War II, but then he was a veteran from the Korean War, and a lot of my aunts and uncles, were in World War II.
Other than the brief history of my grandmother's side, do we have any other stories about our family?
Oh, lots of stories. In terms of stories that I think exemplify the American dream for a lot of people, is that my grandfather on my father's side, actually all 4 of my great-grandparents, so your great-great-grandparents who were the parents of those kids that came over from Italy, none of them read or wrote, and then my grandfather, he had to quit school in 4th grade, so he had a 4th grade education, but it was in Italian. So they were doing manual labor type jobs, seamstress, that kind of thing, and my father was in public school in New York City, and he actually took a test. You know, we have standardized testing now, and they had this test to see, I guess, how the kids were doing. It was whatever their standard test was. And so the opportunity there was the person who got the highest score on that test was going to be offered a full ride to college. Well, none of my family had ever been to college on either side. That was something that wealthy people did. And when the gentleman who got the highest score, his father was a doctor, and said, I can pay for my child to go to college, and he very generously said, I'd like you to give it to the person who got the 2nd highest score, and that was my father. So Grandpa got to go to college for a full ride, all 4 years, and he ended up doing very well for himself and moved down south after having his first 4 kids up in New York, and then down south, and owned his own company by 30 years old, and just became the epitome of the American dream. So we have been very fortunate from one man's very generous act of kindness.
And because we're Italian or Sicilian, do we have any members of the mafia in our family?
None that we talk about.
And last but not least, do we have any genealogical records, and if so, where are they?
Right here. We have some records of the U.S. citizenship of my grandmother, your great-grandmother. We have seen, I think I mentioned before, and we've seen the records of, at Ellis Island, of my grandparents coming over, and a lot of them we don't have, but we did just sign up for Ancestry.com, so maybe we'll get some, but we do have some.
Thank you for sitting down with me.
It is my pleasure.